Okay, great to see so many of you on. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Pinto from Phoenixville Public Library, and welcome to our 250th birthday celebration for one of the greatest and most revolutionary figures in music, the one and only Ludwig van Beethoven. Hope you've at least sent a card this year, okay? We're thrilled to have with us tonight noted conductor and professor Jason C. Tramm. Jason has been hailed as a conductor to watch by Symphony magazine. Maestro Tramm's work in the operatic, symphonic, and choral realms has received critical acclaim throughout the United States and abroad. He currently serves as the director of choral activities at Seton Hall University, director of music ministries at the Ocean Grove Great Auditorium, artistic director of Mid-Atlantic Artistic Productions, and principal guest conductor of the Long Island Concert Orchestra. He's also the host of the podcast Music Matters with Jason Tramm. And on a personal note, as a choir singer myself for many years now, I've enjoyed the experience of being conducted by Jason in the annual Ocean Grove Choir Festival and can personally attest to the knowledge, passion, and intensity that he brings to making great music. It's really great to have you here tonight with us, Jason. Podium is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to the Phoenixville Public Library for inviting me to talk about my favorite topics, Beethoven, who turns 250 tomorrow. Happy birthday, Ludwig van Beethoven. I promise my lecture will not go up to the time of his birth until I won't cross the midnight threshold. But so thank you so much for joining us tonight. When we study Beethoven, it's like studying a great Renaissance painting. And over the years, artists, the public adds layers on top of it. So what we do when we approach Beethoven today is to take away some of the layers that were added by generations after Beethoven. So the Romantic period, who Beethoven would herald, would give Beethoven some real glossy things. They would say there was a rumor saying that he was born of nobility. They would make him Ludwig von Beethoven, which would denote that he was from royal lineage, which he wasn't. Van Beethoven's a Flemish surname. There's surviving Van Beethovens, and that's not true. But the Romantic loved the fact that this was an artist, a hero. They made him into a quasi-mythical figure because of his great talent. And that was typical. The Romantic period was looking to find a hero, and here was a man who overcame his physical limitations, shook his fist to the royalty. He's noted as saying, there are many dukes and princes, but there's only one Beethoven, right? And we know Beethoven for his fiery personality, his innovative and groundbreaking and frankly shocking musical innovations. And we're going to look at some of those today. So I've got the beautiful bust of Beethoven. I've decided to take some of Beethoven's images off his Facebook page. I kid around, but we're gonna look at some of the portraits that were done during his lifetime, and we'll see him throughout all his different periods, from where he was born in Bonn to his beginnings in Vienna to his heroic middle period, and look at the later period as well. And innovations were made in all of these. And feel free to stop me and ask me questions. I love to talk to you all. I love to stop and to add some of what questions you may have. So please feel free to stop, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to start with 1770, as Beethoven was born in Bonn. Beethoven comes from a musical family. It's really important. His grandfather, Ludwig, was a very, very important, he was the grandson of Ludwig van Beethoven, who was a very prominent musician, and he was the Kapellmeister of Bonn, he was the music director. He was the boss. He was a man of great esteem in his city, and his family was most proud of him. And his father, Johann, was not at the caliber or the level of achievement of his grandfather. His father had alcohol issues throughout his life, becoming a raging alcoholic towards the end of his life, which affected Beethoven greatly. We know that fathers with musical prodigies, like Mozart, Mozart's father promoted him as the child virtuoso and took him and his sister on the road and tried to make that a money-making opportunity to give their talented young children a chance to play for royalty, to make money off that to support the family. So Mozart traveled all over Europe and played for kings and queens and in Italy and England and all over at the time. Well, Beethoven's father tried to capitalize on that as well. He tried to make Beethoven into the next Mozart. He tried to, and it didn't, while he was extremely talented, he didn't get the same acclaim as the young Mozart did. Who knows why. But Beethoven's father used to be at tears. The contemporary accounts say he used to be at tears at the keyboard. His father would wake him up in the middle of the night and make him practice quasi-abusive practices. I've got a note here. This is actually one of the family friends who says, when Johann von Beethoven, his father, had visitors, Ludwig would sidle over to the piano and play chords with his right hand. His father would say, "What are you splashing around for? Go away or I'll box your ears." One day, Ludwig was playing as usual without notes. He loved to improvise, even at a very young age. When his father came in, "Won't you ever stop after all I've told you?" He played again and his father said, "Now, isn't that beautiful?" Because he was playing with notes. His father said, that is something else. You made up yourself. You are not to do that again." So his father discouraged improvisation. He insisted that he play from the notes. And Beethoven, from the very beginning, wanted to create. He had this creative impulse, even at the age of 7 and 8. And his father was his first music teacher. He subsequently studied with other artists in Bonn, the leading artists in Bonn, and eventually became known as a great, a rising star. And even as Beethoven got into his teens and into his 20s, and he became a member of the local court orchestra, he played viola in the opera orchestra, he became quite accomplished and became a pretty renowned pianist. His talents were luckily recognized. He had a very unhappy home life. His father's alcoholism increased, and he was the oldest of 3 brothers, and he would generally take over. He became like a surrogate father to his 2 younger brothers. So Beethoven's talents were more and more recognized, and he was granted the opportunity to study in Vienna. And of course, Vienna was like New York City if you were a Broadway person today. That was the place you wanted to be. You wanted to go to New York, you wanted to go to Vienna to be around the best artists in the musical classical world at the time. So of course, Beethoven wanted to study with none other than Mozart. Mozart was, he did hear him play at one time, and he noted that this young man would change the world. And Beethoven was most excited. While he was in Vienna, he was called back home because his mother was dying. So Beethoven went home, and by the time he got there, his mother was already dead. And by the time he got back to Vienna again, Mozart was dead. So he did not get to study with Mozart, which was most unfortunate, but he was able to study with another great artist of the age, Franz Joseph Haydn. And with Haydn, I'm going to play you one piece of music from this Bonn period, and this was not performed during Beethoven's lifetime. This was a cantata commissioned to be performed in honor of the death of Emperor Joseph II. It was rehearsed but never performed. The 19-year-old Beethoven rehearsed it, but there were many challenges. The players in the orchestra in Bonn said this piece was unplayable. The wind writing was almost impossible. The string writing was most difficult, and there were huge problems technically, and the players just couldn't understand it. You're going to notice that this is a real theme in Beethoven's music, that he would write music that was a real advance for the technique of its time. Let's listen to a little bit of 19-year-old Beethoven's music, and let's see what we can draw from this. Here we go. This piece is a kind of a curiosity today, but in its time, it was, this is an experiment for 19-year-old Beethoven who is just learning how to really put these things together. And there's a lot there. The wind writing is really expressive when you listen to this piece. I encourage you to check it out on your own. You can find it on YouTube or on Spotify. It's certainly there. But it was never performed in Beethoven's lifetime. It wasn't premiered until 50 years after the composer's death. And there's so much of the young Beethoven in there. While there's a lot indebted to his teachers, there's a lot of the young Beethoven waiting to be discovered as well. It wasn't until 1792 that Beethoven enters his early period. And here we see Beethoven become eventually, first he receives acclaim as a solo pianist, and he becomes the toast of the town in Vienna. And I'm going to play you a short video from a movie done by the BBC, which I think is fantastic. I teach a course on Beethoven in Seton Hall, and I love to play this because this kind of puts into a contemporary relation what he was like when he hit the scene. There was nothing like it. This young man, he was viewed by the cultural Viennese as a little bit crude, a little bit unkempt. He had wild hair. He had a kind of a very, very strong personality. He knew the quality of his work and he knew what he was doing. Beethoven's piano benefited by the instrument's advances in technology. When you think about Mozart and you think about Haydn, you can make the argument that they were mostly harpsichord players. From their youth, they were trained on the harpsichord. The piano was gradually being invented and expanded upon while they were active. So the musicians are always taking the technology and expanding on it. Well, Beethoven had new advances in technology, and he exploited those to the fullest with the thicker strings, with a more soundboard that can hold more pressure, giving it more sound. So Beethoven's going to exploit those things, and you're going to hear those. Of the two pianists, you have Daniel Stiebold, who was the toast of Paris, and there were two of these that we know that actually occurred. There were piano battles held in the homes of the aristocracy, where two great virtuosos would get together and duke it out, and the audience, all aristocrats, would see who was the better person that evening. So let's take a listen to see who wins this one between a young Beethoven and a Stiebold. Here we go. I think you know the answer already. Okay, share screen. Oops. This is the hardest part for me, is the technique. I'll be right there, folks. I'm just figuring out how to change the picture. Boom, there we go. Okay, here we go. Piano battle, Stiebold.
Fame in Vienna. Within just a few years of his arrival, he was already wildly popular as the city's foremost improviser. Contenders would spar in contests where each had to improvise on a well-known piece of music. And to maintain his position, Beethoven had to see off the competition, taking on the heavyweights of the European music scene.
Ladies and gentlemen, Herr Beethoven tonight will meet more than his match, I believe. May I present the brilliant, the hitherto unbeaten, all the way from Paris? Don't hold that against him. He's dexterous, he's dashing, he's debonair, he's Monsieur Daniel Stiebold.
This is the old style of Mozart. Lighter, almost a harpsichord touch.
So when are you going to start? We haven't got all day.
Graceful and elegant.
Toing. Absolutely delightful. And now, I introduce the toast of our beloved Vienna. We know him, we love him. His fingerwork is finesse itself. But is he the best? Let's find out. Herr Ludwig van Beethoven!
Gives you an idea of the effect this man had on these contemporaries. I just love that dramatization, because here you see the two styles, not just two men battling it out for artistic supremacy. You see this two styles battling it out. You see the classical style melting into a more romantic style that Beethoven was going to innovate. People always ask me, was Beethoven a romantic composer? And I'm going to say no. Beethoven was firmly a classical composer, because his music, he wrote within the classical idioms, but just pushed the boundaries to their breaking point. So you can look at his ending, we'll look at his late period pieces. You can make some arguments about those, but even the latest period pieces are still within the classical forms. He hasn't broken that. He's still within those forms. He just stretches them to almost like as far as they can go. And we'll talk about that a little later as we get there. Let me change my screen back to what we were doing. And this Vienna period is where Beethoven comes into his own. There is also a change in how musicians made their livings that was happening around Beethoven and with the composers the generation before him. When you look at someone like Haydn, who Beethoven knew quite well and actually studied with, Beethoven studied with Haydn, and he wasn't the best student. Beethoven hired somebody to do his harmony exercises and hired somebody else to do his counterpoint exercises. He couldn't be bothered. He said he didn't get much out of the lessons with Haydn. Haydn was really the reigning composer past Mozart's death, and wrote 104 symphonies and the great creation of many, many, many masterworks. But Beethoven, he found his lessons a little pedantic, and he was a little of a rebel. Beethoven, as you can see in that movie, they portray him as a rebel, and he had a very strong personality, and that's represented by everyone who came into contact with him. I'm going to read a quote from a contemporary source on this period, and this really tells who Beethoven was. He had a very gruff sense of humor that you can see in his music always, and you have to take that into account when you interpret his music. Here we go. In whatever company he might be, he knew how to produce such an effect upon every hearer that frequently not an eye remained dry when he played the piano. While many would break out into loud sobs, for there was something wonderful in his expression in addition to the beauty and originality of his ideas and his spirited style of rendering them. After ending an improvisation of this kind, he would burst into loud laughter and mock his hearers on the emotion he had caused in them. "You are fools," he would say. "Who can live among such spoiled children?" he would cry. That was Beethoven. He was a gruff man, and but you could hear in his music there was something very, very exciting. He was going to introduce in this period. You're going to see him experiment. You're going to hear, for example, I'm going to play you a little of the Pathetique Sonata. This is number 8 in C minor. And this is one of those pieces, one of his innovative pieces towards the end of the, this is actually in the early Viennese period, and he's experimenting with what the piano can do. Let's hear a little bit of this. You're going to hear great grandeur and sweep in Beethoven's playing, and that's going to come out further and further in his writing, in his expression. From the very beginning, he's looking to put more into the music, more expression, more, I'm going to call it narrative. There's more storytelling. There's going to be more of expression. He's going to look to expand the boundaries of his predecessors, of Haydn and Mozart. And it looked like, people ask me about Mozart. You have to realize that Mozart died at 36. Beethoven lived till 57. Haydn lived until his late 70s. So each of these composers, they developed and they gradually, I think if Mozart would have lived longer, he was experimenting with new harmonic grounds and going into that direction as well. Wouldn't that be fascinating if we had another year of Mozart, another 20 years or 30 years of Mozart's life, what would have been written? But I think he was anticipating what Beethoven's going to pick up. I want to move over to his first symphony. Now, the symphony was where a composer would really prove their mettle. He knew that when he wrote his first symphony, he was going to be compared immediately to Mozart, to Haydn, to the greats of the musical world. And the symphony was the exalted genre of the large orchestra. And you'll see in Beethoven a lot of experiments happening with his string quartets, with chamber music, with his piano sonatas that are going to lead into his symphonies. And his first symphony is very much indebted to his teacher Haydn and also to Mozart as well. I'm going to play a little bit. Typical of the symphony of Haydn, you're going to have an introduction to introduce the symphony, and then we're going to have sonata form in the first movement. And sonata form is based upon two themes. You have a first theme, and you have a contrasting second theme, and that's the contrast and variety between those themes is what makes up the interesting part of the symphony. And I'm going to play you the first part of the symphony, the introduction, and then a little bit of the exposition where you hear that. And in this first symphony, they're very short. It's very compact. I just conducted this symphony. I think the whole thing is about 24 minutes, 25 minutes. As opposed to Beethoven's third symphony, which is something like 47 to almost 50 minutes long. So Beethoven's going to expand the form, and this is going to be something that Beethoven does throughout his life, is take forms and experiment, add new details, go in different directions, and increase what was possible in these forms. Let's listen to a little bit of the first symphony in C major. This is the work of a 28-year-old Beethoven, I want to say. Something like that, right around that age. Right off the bat, there's a little musical joke. He gives you a tonic dominant in the wrong key. So it's a symphony in C major. The audience expects theme 1 to start in C major. But this is a joke that Haydn did too, and this is something Beethoven would have obviously known. So here right off the bat, he's experimenting and giving the audience something that they wouldn't expect. So let's take a listen. A slow introduction. The audience is now wondering, has the symphony started? Where's theme 1? And now the real symphony is going to begin. Theme 1 is presented here. Theme 1. A very classical theme, very much Haydn and Mozart indebted. And that's, I think, Beethoven. Bum, 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 bum. Those hits. Beethoven's contemporaries complained, as his music got more adventurous, that there was so much syncopation and strange offbeats and weird articulation. In fact, in his second symphony, the last movement, one of the contemporary critics called it a wounded dragon that wouldn't die, that was thrashing about. I love that. I think it's one of my favorite symphonies too. And I always find that funny, is that a lot of times contemporaries can't see what's happening, can't see the innovation in front of them, and it's new music, and it challenges them in ways they wouldn't think of before. So this first period is a period of experimentation. He's going to delve into the symphonic genres and take the innovations he's making in his chamber music, like the piano sonata and the smaller genres, and put them into his concerti and into his symphonies. Now that brings us to what we call the heroic period, or his middle period. And there's a picture of Beethoven with eyes of fire and writing away. And this is Beethoven, some of Beethoven's most famous and popularly programmed music. We've got things like the Appassionata. Let's listen to a little bit of the Appassionata. In this period, Beethoven's idiosyncrasies are going to multiply. He's going to experiment, and he's going to find his voice. Why do they call it the heroic period? His third symphony is the Heroica, which means heroic. Originally, it was dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, who Beethoven was a revolutionary. He was someone who identified with the French Revolution. He thought this was great, and he was aligned with a lot of revolutionaries that were young and hungry of his contemporaries. Well, as soon as Napoleon declared himself emperor, Beethoven ripped out the page and changed it to heroic, and he took away what the original was, the Bonaparte Symphony. So let's listen to a little bit of Appassionata and listen for the drastic changes between forte and piano, and how Beethoven uses very large textures, big, loud sounds, highs and lows, big contrasts. The contrasts, a lot of them would bother his contemporaries, especially people like Haydn. In fact, Beethoven and Haydn had a big quarrel. Beethoven showed Haydn one of his pieces, a chamber piece, and he said, the audience isn't going to understand this. You should change it, or you should present something else. And Beethoven got furious and stormed out of the room. So they would reconcile later. I'll tell that story a little later. Here's a little bit of the Appassionata. Listen for these drastic changes. Also, you're going to hear a famous motive in the left hand, da, 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 da. Just listen, keep your ears tuned for that as well. There it is. So that's so important. The piano was originally called the piano a forte, which means soft and loud, because the harpsichord could only do one dynamic. You could change the dynamic of a harpsichord by playing the second manual, which could make the whole thing softer and the whole thing louder, but there was no gradations of tempo. There was no thunderously loud by really, really soft. And Beethoven was going to exploit the technology that was changing around him. And his technique that we saw in that video, the fast arpeggios, the repeated notes, those are things that evolved in piano technique over time. And Beethoven was at the cutting edge of what was possible. And he was going to inspire people like Franz Liszt, who was going to be the next generation's, one of the next generation's great pianists to evolve their technique. I'm going to show you now, I'm going to start Symphony number 3. Now, we heard the music that was indebted to Haydn and Mozart in Symphony number 1, very classical theme. I could spend, to be honest, I could spend 6 hours talking about any one symphony. So I'm talking quickly about these, but feel free to stop me and jump in if you have any questions about that. I'm going to play a little bit of Symphony number 3, because here Beethoven is going to do something totally original. He's going to start the piece with 2 chords, 2 E flat major chords, bump, bump, and go right into the primary theme. So basically he discards the introduction and just starts theme 1. It's a very drastic and it's totally a Beethoven thing to do. Let's take a listen. This is Nicholas Harnoncourt's interpretation. Theme 1. That bum 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 be da 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 bum bum. Those syncopations are weird, and it jolts the music and gives it like a punch that you don't expect it to have. And that's what Beethoven's contemporaries, it jarred them, it surprised them. They'd never heard anything like that before. Let's keep going a little bit more. Theme 2. This is a much longer piece of music. This goes on at least twice. The first movement goes on for more than twice the time it does in his other symphonies. This is music of grand sweep of expanded designs. Instead of 2 French horns, you now have 3 French horns, because he wants more color. He wants more power in the orchestra. Beethoven was a great innovator of what was possible, of what the instruments can do. He demanded the absolute perfection from his players. And often the parts he wrote were almost unplayable for the orchestras of their time. They would practice, they would work, and he would demand absolute perfection. He actually told, this is a young Beethoven, he told his for one of his orchestras, he goes, "Do you think I think about your fiddle when the muse comes to me and gives me music?" I love that. And this is something that's going to be a recurring theme in Beethoven, was he expected the best of everybody. And even when they couldn't do it, and he was very often get angry at people and storm out, but he was a stormy personality. He demanded the best. And a lot of times, as we're going to see in his later period, he was writing music for the future because it was almost unplayable by the musicians of his time. But we're going to understand more about that when we get there. There's something very important about this period of time. Beethoven was gradually experiencing his famous hearing loss. Get out of here for a second. There we go. So Beethoven was going to he started to have terrible tinnitus, and his hearing, his high range pitch was starting to get strange. The buzzing in his ears was very concerning. He would go see doctor after doctor after doctor, and they would try to help him, but really nothing seemed to work. And I'm going to read a little bit out of a famous document that Beethoven wrote. That's this is called the Heiligenstadt Testament, and this is part explanation for his two brothers, and this is part suicide note. This was never sent, but it was written while he was recovering. He was trying to recover in the country and trying to repair his hearing. Doctors sent him there. They gave him things to try, and nothing seemed to work. And Beethoven was at the height of his powers as a pianist. He was becoming a very successful. His music publications were very successful. He was making a good living. He was in constant demand by the aristocracy to teach lessons, and he was becoming more and more part of a leader in the Viennese musical culture. And he was in great despair at this time period as his hearing loss really deepened and got worse in this period. So I'm going to read a little bit of this translation of this famous document of 1802. For my brothers Karl and Johann Beethoven, oh, you men who think or say I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on my heart and my soul has been full of the tender feeling of goodwill. I don't know if that's true, but he certainly writes in a flowery manner. And I was ever inclined to accomplish great things. That, of course, is true. But think that for 6 years now, I've been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible. Though born with a fiery, active temperament, which we know, even susceptible to diversions of society, I was soon compelled to withdraw myself, to live alone. And at times I tried to forget all this. Oh, how harshly was I flung back by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. Yet it is impossible for me to say to people, speak louder, shout, for I am deaf. How could I possibly admit to an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others? A sense which I once possessed to the highest of perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or have ever enjoyed. And he starts to say that that people don't understand him, that he's had to withdraw from his friends, he'd withdraw from society. And he goes on, it's a long letter, but I'm going to give you the end. He goes, thanks to it in my art, I did not end my life by suicide. Instead, Beethoven's going to find his expression and his connection with people through his compositions. And it's only by withdrawing from society and becoming more alone that Beethoven's able to take what's inside him and put that into the music. And he's going to change music forever and open the door to the Romantic period by infusing this classical music from this middle period, late to mid to late middle period, and on to his late period with this increased narrative, drama, rhetoric. He's going to tell stories. As a conductor, when I conduct the great symphonies or the great choral works, you have to know, especially in the symphonies, what was going on in Beethoven's life. What was happening? Why did he write this way? What are some of the things? And he would push every convention and every boundary in ways that, frankly, no one's ever seen before. I'm going to start with Symphony number 5. Now, Symphony number 3 goes on for almost 50 minutes, from 24 minutes in Symphony number 2 to almost an hour in Symphony number 3. Beethoven's going to rediscover in Symphony number 5 brevity. He's going to take that motive, which is just 2 descending minor thirds, not really a motive, more like a fragment, and turn that into one of the greatest symphonies ever written. And we could argue all day which are the greatest symphonies of Beethoven. It's like, which are my favorite of my 4 children? Very difficult to do, as each one is totally unique and has their own strengths and merits, and Beethoven solves a problem in each one. The symphonies of Beethoven are so incredibly complex. For their time, they were the hardest to play. The musicians, they struggled through, they learned, they adapted. Playing technique evolved by people learning to play Beethoven symphonies. For example, the Ninth Symphony was unplayable by the double bass players of its time. They just could not play what was written. They didn't have the technical flexibility yet. So players were trained to do that in the next generation. So now it becomes standard repertoire. We see the same with all of Beethoven's repertoire. He demanded the absolute of what's possible for those instruments. Let's take a look at Symphony number 5. Symphony number 5, we throw away, and there's no introduction, bang, here's the first theme, da 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 da. And not only is it the first theme that everyone recognizes, it's in unison. I tell my students at the college, that's like sending a text in all capital letters. It's like, all exclamation points, or writing an email with all capital letters. That's such an obvious device, and it hits the listener over the head with that theme, which they're going to hear over and over and over again. Some more innovations of Symphony No. 5. Beethoven connects all four movements with that opening motive. Every movement is infused with da, 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 da. Either it's played backwards, or it's played upside down, or it's used in the bass line over another melody. But Beethoven uses that theme in a way that's in a cohesive story that's never been, to that level, has never been done before. He also uses key relations in an amazing way. It's a symphony in C minor. Well, Beethoven's not just writing a symphony in abstract form. He's going to make this a statement of light over darkness. This is something that's also going to be in the Ninth Symphony as well, and very important for Beethoven. Also in his choral fantasia as well. He starts in a stormy C minor, and all hope is sucked out of this piece. It's a piece, there's the da, 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 it's minor, it's stormy, it's fiery, and then we have a contrasting theme too, which is in E flat major, which is the relative major, and it makes sense. There's some hope, but then it's stamped out in the end. By the time the fourth movement comes along, there is a triumphant C major chord as light triumphs over darkness. This is a big part of Beethoven's struggle. People often think that this is Beethoven's own personal struggles coming to light in this music. And this is music of grandeur, of power, of someone being brutally honest about themselves. And I think the more you study and read about Beethoven, the more you hear him in his music. Beethoven No. 5. This is Leonard Bernstein. No, this is Carlos Kleiber and the Vienna Philharmonic, one of my favorite conductors. One of my favorite pieces. All those fermatas, or the places where da 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 da, there's a fermata, it holds, it breaks the rhythmic action. A lesser composer, da 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 da, it could just go on without stopping. But Beethoven, being the master dramatist, adds gravitas and weight by stopping the tempo, by stopping the rhythmic motion. And that's one of the hardest things a young conductor can learn, is how to control that famous first page. It seems so easy, but when I was 24 years old, I conducted this in Romania with a state orchestra in Romania. I had 100 players in front of me, and I was a very young kid. And I get up there and you ta 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 ta. It's one of the hardest things to control and really get the proportions just right. And it took years to get where I felt organic with that piece. Let's go on. This is all theme 1. The horns are going to have a special prominence here, and some have called it the horns of hell of this piece. Like, it's kind of always barking up there, and it's this aggressive music. Theme 2 is going to provide some contrast. Let's see how he does that. Listen to the bass. Dun, 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 dun. It's still there. That the doubt and the guilt still there. Dun, 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 dun. Syncopation. That's the whole exposition. It's very short, very concise. Beethoven really does an incredible job of maintaining how tight that is. In a symphony, you have that exposition, and then you have the development section. And the development section, where the two themes battle for prominence. And we see the composer take them through multiple keys and changes. And this is where the composer's craft is the most recognizable. Beethoven uses the winds and the brass in ways that they've never been used before. He expands how each instrument groupings. I want you to listen as this development section goes on. Listen for how each grouping of instruments echoes each other in ways that Mozart and Haydn hadn't done to this extent. I'm going to skip this exposition. It repeats itself, and then we go right into the development. It's going to take you through different keys on a journey. Here we go. Feel that tension. Music of power and grandeur. Strings, brass, strings. And then we're back to the music from the beginning again. I'm going to play the very end of this Symphony No. 5 first movement. It's such profound music, and when you listen to it, you can't help but hear Beethoven's struggles internally, his story. And each movement of the symphony is in one story. If you look at the symphonies before, even Haydn and Mozart, there's 4 different movements that are separated and very different musically. Beethoven's connected them. He's connected the dots. He's added much more rhetoric and storytelling and expressive ideas. There's so much idiosyncratic things going on in terms of phrase lengths, the groupings of instruments, strange like you just heard there were like really quiet chords in the winds, and then the whole orchestra would come pounding in. These are things that Beethoven innovations he made, and they've become normal to us today, but by the ears of his contemporaries, they were way ahead of his time. Here's the end of this piece. Very fiery. This is the coda. This. The music's exhausted. And that's just movement 1. Such incredible, grand music. There's so much conversation in there. Things like There's little snippets of solo instruments, like a bassoon that comes like a question, and it's stamped out and says no. I hear so much of this self-doubt, this kind of exploring of fighting, of this man, this hero, this artist overcoming disability all through here. I'm going to play you a little bit of the fourth movement of the same piece. Oops. Because we're not going to have time today, but the fourth movement is one of the most incredible movements because Beethoven forever changes the constitution of the orchestra. Up till now, when this piece in 1809 was written, 1805, excuse me, when this piece was written, there were no trombones in the orchestra. The trombone was considered an instrument of the church, dating back to Gabrielli in Italy, in Venice. But with this piece, Beethoven wanted additional grandeur on the fourth movement. He wanted this explosion of sound. So he added piccolo, contrabassoon, and 3 trombones. So when it comes in the fourth movement, all of a sudden, pow, the orchestra comes in a grand C major, and light has triumphed over darkness. So when you listen to that, the audiences of his day must have been stunned when those instruments, because the trombones add a real punch. Okay, so this is music that was looking forward to the future. And Beethoven, at the end of this period, Beethoven was in the height of his creative power, writing tons of music. His music was very well published and well performed. He was in high demand. And as his hearing worsened, he got to the point where he couldn't play in public anymore. And that was really devastating for him. So then he kind of withdrew. He mostly communicated by writing, and we have his books where he wrote, and those are an incredible resource for us to learn about what he was thinking in his everyday life, in his conversations with his contemporaries, and when he kept a very good journal and he jotted notes down. So we know a lot. He'd also carry a chalkboard and write too. He was his appearance. I'm going to find on the title screen here. Let me share the title screen, and we'll look at his appearance as it changed as well. Middle period. Oops. Present. And now we go to Beethoven, later period. As you can see, Beethoven on the left-hand side, that was a Beethoven who's aging, a Beethoven who's sick often, and on the right, that's towards the end. And of course, on the left is his famous death mask. So we see on the top right, that's a Beethoven who is, and this is right after he wrote the Ninth Symphony, right after he wrote the Missa Solemnis, 2 of the greatest works ever written by anybody. Missa Solemnis has got some of the most challenging music ever written for chorus and orchestra. It's a piece I've never conducted. It's the only major Beethoven work I have not conducted. I've done all the symphonies. I've done all the choral pieces. I've done arias from Fidelio, but I've never conducted the whole Fidelio. And I've done 2 of the overtures for Leonore or Fidelio. But Missa Solemnis is one that's on my bucket list. It's some of the most incredible music. And here, the music he wrote here, and along with his Diabelli variations for piano, his string quartets, and a couple late piano sonatas, Beethoven's writing music for the future, because this music is so difficult. When Beethoven wrote, he would revise constantly. When you look at the manuscripts of Beethoven, they are a mess. There's coffee spills. There's like he erased so much that he had to paste a paper over and write on it again. He scribbled, he crossed out there. They're really hard to read. And typical to his life, his rooms where he stayed in apartments were filthy. They were disgusting. And if it wasn't for his friends coming and actually changing his clothes and cleaning them, he would have worn the same dirty clothes every day. His friends would come in and help him. They would make sure that his chamber pot was empty, or it would just be sitting there full. He really lost his appearance. He stopped caring about a lot of that stuff and was just engrossed in his music. Well, with the Ninth Symphony and the Missa Solemnis, this is music of great power and great vision. I'm not going to have time to play the Missa Solemnis, unfortunately, but within the Missa Solemnis, this is his first mass in C major when he wrote in the middle period. It's maybe 50 minutes long. About 50 minutes long. The Missa Solemnis is like an hour and a half. Just the Agnus Dei is 20 minutes long. It's incredibly difficult and very challenging. And Beethoven puts things in it that have never been in a mass before. Like, for example, we've got the slow, sad opening, but then in the Agnus Dei, but then we'd have this almost opera aria in the middle where the soprano comes blazing in above the tremolo strings, and then the trumpets play military music in the background as if the war is approaching on stage and happening around the soprano and around the chorus, and then the forgiveness of God comes in. He was confronting great questions of his own mortality, I believe, and he was experimenting with new things. In the Ninth Symphony, he takes an experiment that he did in the choral fantasia in his middle period, and he applies it to the symphony. He takes the text of Goethe, he takes the Ode to Joy text of Schiller, and he includes it in a symphony. This had never been done before, just like adding trombones. Here, Beethoven is hybridizing the choral cantata with the symphony, two different genres. Beethoven puts them together into a Franken symphony, which is going to be the blueprint for the romantic choral symphony. And here he does a 3-movement symphony, which is very, very long, about an hour and 10 minutes, so really long music, maybe it's even longer, about an hour and 15, I think. You've got the first 3 movements are in traditional forms, but very, very long, but very well connected. You've got symphony in D minor. So we're going to have the same Light Over Darkness. We have D minor, a stormy key. We end in D major with the chorus. But he does something here that had never been done before. I'm going to play you a little bit of the end of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And we're going to listen to this wild music. It's like a recitative, and it's played by the basses and the orchestra. And it's like a narrator. I'm going to point this out. They have a narrator, and the narrator is going to introduce a theme, this for the theme from the symphony in first movement, and the orchestra is going to throw it away. Okay, not that one. They're going to go back and say, how about this theme? And theme 2 is going to come in, and the narrator is going to say, no, not that theme either. Then he's going to play the third movement theme, and he's going to throw that away. And finally, you're going to hear the theme that we've all come to love, dun, 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 the Ode to Joy theme, and then the orchestra takes that theme triumphantly and makes a huge choral cantata based on that theme. It's some of the most incredible writing, and this is new music. This is music of the future. Here we go. Let me find a great recording. Leonard Bernstein, here we go. One of my favorite theory persons calls this the horror fanfare. That first chord would have shocked his audience. That's incredibly dissonant for 1822 or 1824. Listen to that again. Here's our narrator. Not that music. Knock that racket off. Here's music from the first movement. Ta-ta. Not that one. Try this music. It's the scherzo. Movement 3. Nope. This is movement 3. Sorry, that was movement 2. The slow movement. But the narrator says no, not that one either. Better, but no. Keep thinking. Here we go. The narrator says, and then the theme starts proper. So that's not just a movement of a symphony. That is a new method of expression, a new mean of expression, a new introspective. It took Beethoven, he wrote a lot less music in the end of his life. From about 1812 to 1817, Beethoven didn't write a lot of music, and he had a lot of problems. He was guardian for his nephew Carl, who was, and he fought with Carl's mother constantly about who would have custody of Carl, and Carl was very unhappy, and he tried to commit suicide, and it was a terrible time in Beethoven's life, dealing with both being almost completely deaf and also going through these legal challenges and battles. So he was also sick at the same time. So there was a lot going on. Beethoven's productivity was limited. So he spent a lot of time thinking about these things, I believe, and applying these concepts that were so broad and so vast. And the idea of putting a gigantic choir movement and soloists in a symphony, that's outstanding and just uniquely groundbreaking. And we see that in Beethoven over and over again, this depth of emotional expression. His symphonies are so much more complex than anything that was written before him. If you look, Haydn wrote 104 symphonies, Mozart wrote 41 symphonies, and Beethoven only 9, because his symphonies are just so full and packed of emotion and of complexity. And the complexity would get more and more. The players and the singers, Beethoven was, if you look at Mozart's writing, when he wrote a piece of music, it was basically done. It was amazing. He wrote so much music so quickly. And when you look at the manuscripts, they're flawless. There's not a mistake. There's not a scratch mark. When you look at Beethoven's, it's a mess. It's like so hard to decipher because there's like spilled coffee on one part and there's like just scribbles all over it. And he's changed it here. He revised his music. He was revising the Second Symphony towards the end of his life. It was never finished to him. Mozart, it was like divinely came down to him. He wrote it down. It's like he was able to copy it so fast. Who knows how he did it? But Beethoven was never that way. So Beethoven was always revising and changing things. Well, when he couldn't hear anymore, I guess he couldn't change as easily. He couldn't hear what wouldn't work. Like one of the singers in the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, when it was premiered, he called him, he said, "This is impossible. Why must I suffer like this?" And he didn't care. He's like, this is what I wrote. You must sing it, And even though he couldn't hear it, because one of the complaints about all of Beethoven's late music is that it's incredibly high, and that choirs, there's a passage which has got 15 bars of high A natural for the sopranos. They just sit on for 15 bars, and the tenors have a similar. We always joke that it should be symphony in C major because it'd be a lot easier for the tenors and sopranos to sing. But Beethoven was he wanted that effect of people probably struggling and giving their absolute most to, and he was writing music for future generations. He wasn't thinking about right now. He was thinking about, this is music that's going to live on well past me. And the Romantics were so inspired by Beethoven. He became the poster child for the artist as hero, the artist as creative genius. This was an artist who was the first generation of artists who made their living not as servants to the aristocracy, but as independent contractors. He made his living performing, writing music, publishing, and he didn't need he didn't need the sponsorship of one aristocrat like Haydn did, and many of the musicians before him. So Beethoven was a groundbreaker on so many fronts, and I encourage you to go out there and explore. The more you explore, I encourage you to read about Beethoven. Maynard Solomon's book is my favorite. His biography is the gold standard. I check it out. Every time I pull it out, I've read it 3 or 4 times. I always learn something new, because to be a conductor, you have to get in the mind of a great composer. And I always love to conduct Beethoven because I get to study him again. I get to review his whole life and how this piece fits in, what he was going through personally. And I find that every time I look at it, it's like looking at a great painting, like a Mona Lisa. When you look at a different angle, it changes the perspective. Also, as I get older, every time I conduct, let's say Symphony 5, I come back to it with a different interpretation because the edges are slightly different. The players are different. Everything changes. And you have to rethink what was Beethoven trying to say. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yes, please feel free to unmute yourselves, ask a question. Can you see the chat there, Jason?
Thank you so much. I do love this stuff. It's not hard to be enthusiastic about Beethoven. It's the most exciting music ever written. No questions.
There's so much that you said. One of the things that was interesting was to hear the narration, to hear the narrator part. And that was interesting because I don't think that I've ever really heard it like that before. So I feel like you've introduced me to a lot of things that I need to go back and listen to more closely.
He's one of those people, the more you dig in, that is it's like an opera within a symphony. That's like a accompanied recitative where he mixes in, there's nothing like it. It was a blueprint for the future.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Pat. This was exciting. What is your heritage in music? Oh, I'm a conductor. I was trained. In my past, I did a lot of opera, and I got to be around a lot of the great conductors, and I assistant conducted quite a bit in opera. And I'm very eclectic musically. I do choral music, I do orchestral music, I do symphonic music. I view it all as like a well-balanced diet. I take one with me to the other. So conducting Beethoven makes me a better choral conducting. Conducting choral music makes me a more interesting orchestral conductor. So I love to just jump around and do different musical styles. And Beethoven always returns me to my roots, though. Do I have music in my family? A good question. No, my parents were both not musical. My mom played the piano a little bit. She played for her Sunday school class when I was a kid, and I remember that. But they both loved music, and their first operas were the operas I conducted as I started to grow into that field. They supported me always, though. I was a singer at age 5, a boy soprano soloist, and I always knew I wanted to do music. I just didn't know what in music. From Laura, thanks for a fascinating presentation. It was really interesting. Thank you so much, Laura.
I have a question. I heard someplace that after Beethoven, composers would not write more than 9 symphonies. Is there any?
Well, I'll give you some. Well, Brahms only wrote 4. I think a lot of it is that a symphony became so complicated to write. I mean, you had to take the combined genius of Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Schubert, Mendel's. You had to take these great artists, and how do you say something unique? And if you remember, the symphony is really a classical art. It's a classical genre. It's really, when a composer writes a symphony, even today, they're hearkening back to the classical period. That's the intellectual music of the classical period. So a lot of the best composers of the Romantic period considered that quaint and old-fashioned. So they were writing program music like Scheherazade or like Night on Bald Mountain. They were writing more descriptive music. They've gone in a different direction. They weren't writing like forms from the past, which a symphony is kind of like an abstract form from the past. So it's a good question. I also takes so much time to write a huge symphony. So not that many got a chance to write that many. Mahler being a rare exception. Great questions. I love this. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. And if you want to learn more about me, I have a website, jasontramm.net, and my podcast. I explore musical innovation in the time of COVID, as seen by the most distinguished artists in the field. I've got a star of the Metropolitan Opera coming on this Friday, and I have a concert violinist. I've also got a reggae drummer, and I look at different genres and different artists and try to draw conclusions on how we come out of this as artists in the time of COVID-19, which has crippled the arts these days. So it's amazing to see what my colleagues are doing, how they're innovating, and how creative people can be. So thank you so much for letting me speak to you tonight, and I look forward to seeing you in person sometime down the road.
There's another chat question.
Oh, good, bring it. I don't have the chat in front of me. Let me dig that up. I'll answer any question you have. I won't go anywhere. Do we know why Beethoven only one violin concerto? Good question. Well, he wrote 5 piano concertos, and the piano concertos were vehicles for himself. He was the pianist, right? I don't know why he only wrote one. I was supposed to conduct that one concerto. It's one of the greatest pieces ever written. I was supposed to do that in New York City with a violinist from South Korea last year. And that was the first concert of mine that was canceled by COVID. So I was devastated. It was supposed to be Symphony No. 2, the Beethoven Violin Concerto, and one of the overtures. And I was heartbroken because that's one of the only Beethoven pieces I hadn't conducted, and I had it almost memorized by the time I was supposed to start rehearsals. But COVID stopped that in its tracks. He wrote it for a specific occasion for a specific soloist. I think that's why he was commissioned to write that piece. And he probably just never found time to do another. That'd be my guess. I guess the soloist and the commission probably never came for him to do that, because he wrote the triple concerto, which is for violin, cello, and piano. And that was really cool. So I guess he did write the triple concerto, so we can say he wrote another one. Can we look forward to another presentation like this one or any other composer?
Looks like they want you back, Jason.
I'll talk about anything. My students at Seton Hall know I can talk about anything. Conductors love to talk.
We'll try to arrange that.
Yeah, so
Awesome.
I have one question. I would like to know, has the interpretation of Beethoven's music changed during the years?
So drastically, in fact. And this is what's amazing about being alive now. I tell this to my students all the time too. You can go on YouTube and you can type in any conductor that you like, or any soloist, or any orchestra playing any of these pieces, and you can metronome mark the tempi. And you can go back to the earliest recorded examples in the 1920s, the 1920s, and you can hear what tempi they took back then. And performance practice has been evolving ever since it happened. So we often ask, would Beethoven recognize his own music? How much would he identify by a Ninth Symphony performance today when he written? Because he never really heard the Ninth Symphony personally. He was there when it was premiered, and he was kind of conducting. But the story of that one is he was only conducting in like function. The concertmaster told, there was a second conductor who actually conducted the performance, and they told him not to watch Beethoven because he couldn't hear anything. So the music ended and Beethoven was going like this, and then they turned him around and he was getting a standing ovation. And every generation imprints on any artist. So the more time that passes, the more of a crude imprint that happens on these pieces. So when you listen to recordings of even from the 20s and 30s, they're completely different in tempi. So they're much slower. The period music instrument performances of the 80s and 90s and today are much faster in almost every regard. Look at John Eliot Gardner. Or sometimes the composers like von Karajan in the 70s and 60s, they were much slower and more ponderous, much more romantically infused. So that's a great question. They constantly change. Same with piano interpretations. All music changes and is reinvented by the artists we always bring some of ourselves to artwork of the past. Oh, the Kleiber. Kleiber happens to be one of my favorite conductors. He's just got a skill for the dramatic. His storytelling to me always speaks to me. You can listen to 5 recordings of Beethoven 5, and I can hear Kleiber. Even if I haven't heard that performance, I'll know it's him because it's got sparkle. It's got wit. He uncovers a little piece of the story that someone else missed or just didn't get. And he had this electric personality. If you watch Carlos Kleiber conducting live, he's also one of the most incredible physical techniques. Just brilliant physical technique, and one of the masters of my craft. Great question. These are all such great questions. I appreciate this. not hearing any more, I will bid you adieu. I want to thank you all. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Jason. It's been great having you.
Thank you, Mark. And I wish everyone a very happy holiday. Be safe, be healthy, and music will come back. Keep yourself ready for live music's return.
See you in Ocean Grove next year. Yes.
I can't wait. Good night,
Take
everyone.
care, everybody. Good night.
Thanks to Phoenix Hill for doing this.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate that.
Bye-bye.
Take care now. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.